Abstracting Rivers on the Emerging Ambivalence of Relationships to Water in Ireland.
Well, I guess my memory of it really is there were, I suppose, three things. There was water for drinking and for tea. And then there was water for washing everything else, clothes or anything for animals. And in the summertime, water to go and sit in the water, or we didn't really swim in it. Every house had barrels to collect the water. We had the eave gutters all around, the downpipe and into the barrels. And as it rained a lot in Ireland, that was sufficient really for the everyday use of water. Yes, it rarely was a problem. We had a very, very dry summer. Then you had to go and collect barrels of water in the local river or the well. Water for drinking was different, so that had to come from the well. In Ireland, because we had farms, somehow there seemed to be in every townland a well. So that had to be, we had to go to the well on a daily basis for drinking, probably drinking more in summer than in wintertime, mainly tea, and probably 1 or 2 buckets a day would be sufficient. Summertime, when it was very warm, very hot, we had streams on the farm like everywhere else, but you had to go and prepare it. So you had to build a dam. We could splash around in the water there, as children would in a little pond that you can buy today for the back garden.
The project proposes a public water infrastructure and leisure facility on disused industrial filter beds in Dublin. It responds to the growing need for accessible, decentralised water systems while creating space for everyday gathering, maintenance, care and enjoyment. Irish relationality to water has long been oriented towards holy waters, whether through holy wells or animistic bodies of water. But modern infrastructure presents disorders of scarcity, contamination and alienation. So conceptually, the project draws from Zygmunt Bauman's definitions of ambivalence, and it aims to reintroduce openness and uncertainty into a system which is typically defined by control and closure, as is the case with modern infrastructure. And the question of infrastructure is becoming increasingly urgent as Dublin creeps towards hydrological crisis. Population growth, thirsty data centres and increasingly contaminated waterways have amplified strain on outdated infrastructure, while Dublin plans to then divert water from the Shannon River Basin over 170 kilometres away. And in 2019, a malfunction at one of Dublin's main water treatment plants led to the parasitic cryptosporidium entering the water system, and 600,000 people were placed on a boil water notice. And so zooming out, we can draw connections between water, data infrastructure and energy. In Dublin, 70-odd data centres consumed around 20% of the country's total energy in 2022, while again aggravating the city's need for water. And then hundreds of miles away in rural Donegal, the poorly managed construction of a wind farm, which was contracted to supply energy to a data centre, triggered this catastrophic peat slide, leading to widespread waterway contamination. And so in Ireland, water infrastructure reveals kind of broader political and social transformations. And so a key factor in the suppression of ambivalence lies in the shifts in Ireland's water rights throughout its pre-colonial and colonial history. Historic relationality to water has long centred around the use of wells, and so the Hill of Tara was the centre of Ireland's indigenous legal system, Brehon law, and 7 wells encircle the site, which reflects this kind of sacred and constant orientation to water beyond its role as a common resource. And over 3,000 of these wells are scattered across Ireland today, many having persisted as spiritual and therapeutic sites from the period of Brehon law. They embody an ambivalence, and they're enmeshed in a succession of pre-Christian and Christian traditions, where domestic use coincides with deep spiritual reverence. Ritual offerings, circumambulation, and drinking of the water is believed to impart wisdom and curative properties. But colonial efforts during the plantations began to transform water access from communal to privatised, aligning with broader attempts to impose order on the Irish landscape. And so with the rise of common law, water ownership emerged as infrastructure developed to meet urban growth and public health needs. And so by the mid-19th century, Dublin has reached an infrastructural tipping point. The city basin, a private reservoir, was ambivalent with its ornate entrance gate and tree-lined promenade, blending this functional, regulated infrastructure with ambiguous communal use. And likewise, the public drinking fountains installed carried sacred and monumental symbols. And this leads us to today, where infrastructure is largely separated, distanced, and without ambivalence. And so in contrast, group water schemes have emerged in rural Ireland to address inefficiencies in state systems. They use small-scale infrastructures with volunteers responsible for their maintenance, operation, and management. They serve about 10% of the population, using either private water sources or tapping into the public supply. And decisions are made through community engagement in public buildings, with activities extending to field work and educational outreach. Community members contribute monthly subscription fees and elect a committee to manage treatment, distribution, and ongoing maintenance. In contrast to state-run facilities, they become sites of spiritual, communal, and political intervention as ambiguous practices begin to take shape around the infrastructure. So one group water scheme, a ritual occurs with the blessing of the equipment by a priest. And so I propose an urban group water scheme and community leisure centre in Dublin. And it's by blending infrastructure with collective use that relationships to water are surfaced. And this aims to reinforce autonomy, local knowledge, and this cultural connection to water. And so the spaces both reference and facilitate the ceremonial use of water in kind of symbolic and also practical terms. So the site for the group water scheme is the neighbourhood of Bluebell along the Grand Canal in Dublin. And until the 1950s, Bluebell was a farming area on the city's outskirts and has over time been kind of heavily industrialised. And today these large disused filter beds remain on the site, some of which will be used for the water treatment, while 2 will be repurposed for the leisure centre swimming pools. And the group water scheme then operates between state infrastructure and community-led practice, and this model maps how treatment, regulation, and funding link with local management and shared use. And in this way, the model hinges between the necessary infrastructure of modernity and the ambivalence of collective practice. So group water scheme equipment is unfolded along the central corridor, which acts both as a threshold and a connector spine through the building. This then connects to the plumbing for the bathrooms and the kitchens, while rainwater is then captured by the roof and likewise directed through and around the building, while the pool is then naturally cleaned by the adjacent filter beds. And finally, surface treatments begin to define the use of each space. And along the perimeter of the site, the city basin promenade returns, and instead of trees and planting, it's surface markers, drainage gates, and other related infrastructures which demarcate the use of the site. And so the plan is organised around these 3 volumes. On the left, a large flexible meeting space for the members of the group water scheme. In the centre then, a hall for the water filtration equipment, and on the right, facilities for the leisure centre, with an indoor and an outdoor pool adjacent to the canal, all connected by this infrastructural corridor. So St Bridget's Day marks the seasonal renewal of care for water and land at the beginning of the year. And it's around this time that the committee begins preparations for the annual general meeting and anticipates increased public use of the leisure centre. And as rural communities begin the springtime cutting of peat, the AGM takes place behind the peat brickwork facade, setting the schedule for maintenance, testing cycles, and member updates. Summer months see the highest daily use of the pools, and the infrastructure is running at full capacity to meet demand. Aligning with Lunasa, a festival marking collective labour, the mid-season review is carried out to adjust flow rates and report on catchment data. And then from October, the leisure centre winds down for winter with shorter hours. But beyond the site, private domestic connections are surfaced from the ground and reciprocated in public wells, once again demarcated for common use. These wells support year-round visitation and are cared for kind of quietly and informally. In the specification drawings, material descriptions mediate between technical detail and situated cultural practice. For example, the peat brickwork is to be cut and dried in County Offaly under local turbary rights during the summer. And these drawings then begin to bed the maintenance, provenance and seasonality within the architectural design, such as the annual application of paint applied by group water scheme volunteers, aligning with springtime holy well visitation. And so while the central building is the crux of the project, it extends beyond the site boundary and introduces a territorial complexity that facilitates source protection, monitoring, and ceremonial uses. And in doing so, it reintroduces ambivalence into water management through open-ended participatory systems, where the infrastructural design language creates connections from landscape through to treatment and through to everyday domestic use.